will be our future. So from a historic perspective, we have maybe a different approach, but I think it will help us to not only to concentrating on our current problems, but also to learn our tradition and legacy from the past. So, Mihai, the floor is yours, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, István. Köszönöm szépen. Jó reggelt kívánok. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
I'm trying to adjust my voice to this quite early morning venue of ours. István was kind enough to offer me so many topics onto which I could say something, maybe of value, maybe of no value at all. It's like having... Okay. It's like getting close to the Garden of Eden, to the famous tree of knowledge, with more than one apple hanging onto the branches. So I'll try to tackle with all the subjects. It is an impossible task, but I hope I will not disappoint you to the point that you'd leave the room so early in the morning. And I start with a narrative first, and then I'll go into something more concrete that would put political scientists back on track, those who are among us now. As for my political experience, I stand ready to politically commit lies to you whenever you feel like indulging yourself into this. I wait for the Q&A session anyway. So the title, I've changed the title, bearing in mind that I could get to you something more than a barren speech. Keynote speeches are usually meant for people to doze in their chairs. I'll try to give you something that would look like early morning energy. So let's kick it off. The title is Bedtime's Just Around the Corner. And here it is. In roughly 6 weeks, the European Union citizens will be called to cast their votes for the future composition of the European Parliament. The past half of year looked like enough time to carefully prepare, at member states level, all necessary arguments and mechanisms designed to better represent national and party interests in the European legislative. The degree of importance politicians allocate to preparing the forthcoming European elections varies from country to country. At least in Central and Eastern Europe today, parties struggle to draw lists of potential candidates, and names are thrown to the public to test their capacity of gathering votes. Other countries, those willing to take a bigger stake in European elections' local awareness, have already jumped over intra-partisan fierce disputes and began working with carefully selected campaign teams. Last November, there was word that Hungary had invited Steve Bannon, US President Donald Trump's former political strategist, to work with Prime Minister Viktor Orbán in the run-up to the elections. Why him? Why him, Bannon? Apart from his treasurable political strategic knowledge and network of connections, he has set up a movement, the movement, to elect across the member states, and I underline across the member states, right-wing nationalist and populist members in the European Parliament following next May, a project that was hardly welcomed by Mr. Orbán. The chemistry between Mr. Bannon and Mr. Orbán is no longer a secret in Budapest, where Mr. Bannon would have gladly liked to base the headquarters of the movement. At least this is what international media reported. Why Budapest? Because in Mr. Bannon's words, the next European elections would bring the clash between forces led by core EU members, namely Germany and France, and Eurosceptic members like Hungary, who is prepared to deftly rally like-minded EU members around Mr. Orbán's banner. Here comes the paradox. Mr. Orbán's party, the Fidesz, is still a member of the EPP, although suspended since March the 20th, and seriously threatened to be cast out from the group. However, just within the EPP group, he enjoys, with a broad and relaxed smile, enough support and side recognition to face whatever attempt to put his party off the political family. In fact, Fidesz, as seen through his chairman's rhetoric and public statements, is not moving away from the basic ideological principles embodied by the EPP and its members, but tests the fringes of populistic behavior. And this is where Mr. Orban and Mr. Bannon meet and speak the same language. For Mr. Bannon, populism equals right-wing activism with all its traits, as described before, whereas for Mr. Orban, populism, although never invoked or quoted in the open, means, quote-unquote, to put the right questions at the right time. No matter how painful or direct, no matter whether the respective answers could be wrong. The electorate will in the end decide upon them, and it is likely that it will decide in favor of the likes of Mr. Orban. Let us return to Mr. Bannon's activity. He does whatever comes into his powers to make sure that the clash will occur. He was recently quoted saying, in a messianic tone, and I quote, "All I'm trying to be is the infrastructure globally for the global populist movement. Global, that is beyond national borders and against the very attributes of sovereignty the nation-state possesses." And he tirelessly strives to erect this internationalist movement. He pays visits to the leadership of the French far-right National Front. He meets in Zurich with the high-ranking representatives of the Alternative for Germany. He feels like home in Italy after the electoral victory of the populistic parties. He lectures crowds. He delivers speeches. He was recently spotted southeast of Rome in an all but abandoned 13th century monastery atop a mountain next to Colle Pardo, which seems like the best place to establish, in his words, a gladiator school for cultural warriors, unquote. As Benjamin Harnwell, a devoted follower of Mr. Bannon's and his appointee to the head of this school designed to create the future populist vanguard capable of launching an assault on Europe, was heavily quoted saying. Some very days ago, Steve Bannon gave an interview to a major and well-respected continental journal and disclosed some of his future plans, such as helping Mr. Salvini's party to enter the European Parliament. What he acknowledged witnessing, and I call for your attention here too, was, quote, an incredible enthusiasm among youngsters, the extensive usage of Facebook Live, and very complex campaigns that outrun the traditional parties. Salvini and the Lega have brought down to pieces the ancient divide between left and right, unquote. And Mr. Bannon ends the phrase apotheotically, quote, Salvini and Viktor Orban are, in my opinion, the most important political men of today's Europe, unquote. How could he not visit and maybe support Mr. Orban, who, in his views, is a quote-unquote hero and, quote, the most significant guy on the scene right now, unquote. It is indeed hard work to bring together nationalists and populists, all Eurosceptics at their best, around the dream of winning the majority in the European Parliament. Steve Bannon knows their voices are somehow muffled at home and in the continent. They are not properly heard by the continental electorate. And yet, Mr. Bannon knows well that what needs to be done, among other things, is to handicraft a media platform able to make these voices resonate and echoing everywhere, like organ sounds in a medieval cathedral, for the battle cry to reach out to the very emotions of the voters. But there is no time to fulfill this self-imposed task, which means that all shall be ready and set for the next European electoral round, that is in 2024. The drive for unity among populist fringe parties is set on fast forward. Some days ago only, the Italian League and the German Alternative für Deutschland teamed up to form a new group called the European Alliance of Peoples and Nations. It is not about the nation state, it's about peoples and nations, designed to better coordinate their political efforts ahead of the upcoming elections. The Danish People's Party and the Finns Party of Finland joined the group, and it is said that France's National Rally of Marine Le Pen and the Austrian FPÖ, although not at the event, have confirmed their cooperation with the League. Mr. Salvini is bound to unite the political lights in an quote-unquote Europe of common sense, That would curb immigration and return power to national governments who should yield in the end to the unified will of European nations, weary of living in this kind of nation-state Europe. For the far-right national parties, it is then, in 2024, when their European representatives could outnumber the representatives of their groups such as the EPP or the SND. 2019 is a mere rehearsal, nevertheless important, for steering the political boat well. In the meantime, till May, national polls and election outcomes of 2018 and early 2019 suggest far-right parties to gain ground ahead of the European vote. Far-right has become fancy, and far-right appeal using populist formulae seems successful. It is the case of Sweden, whose anti-immigration and Eurosceptic Sweden Democrats Party, mark the paradox, could double its seats in the European Parliament if it will match the 17.6% it scored in a national vote last September. And it is happening in a historically open, prosperous, tolerant, liberal Scandinavia. Some say it looks like a widespread disease affecting Denmark, Norway, and Finland, and now Sweden, looming in the dark for years and then constantly growing in voters' preferences. Let us cast a look into the recent history of Sweden Democrats. In the late 1980s, a bunch of neo-fascist extremists formed the party. In 2010, after decades of shadow and general mistrust, the party leaped in the space of just 3 elections from 5.7% share of national vote, that is 2010 when its representatives entered the parliament, to 12.9% in 2014 and 17.7% the previous year, 2018. The party has become attractive, and there may be just a matter of time before it could be asked to join the governing coalition. Academics would bet for this. It is not happening in Denmark, or Norway, or Austria. Take the case of the latter. The far-right Freedom Party in Austria, the FPÖ, was founded in 1956 by a former unrepentant Nazi, and first won more than 20% of the vote in 1994. When in February 2000, Chancellor Schüssel invited Jörg Haider's FPÖ to join the government, the public outcry forced the EU to adopt sanctions, ceasing cooperation with Vienna, ostracizing the members of the executive, refusing even the basic interaction between the other 14 EU member states at the time and Austria itself. We tend to forget that if the normal course of events would have been spared, Haider would have taken the chancellorship. It did not happen. 17 years after, the FPÖ is today a direct partner of the center-right ÖVP and the second member of the actual coalition. Have you heard of any sound of protest from the European counterparts? There was none. A thick silence, which means acknowledgement. Far-right parties have been offered the chance to come into the limelight and thus accepted, not tolerated, accepted by center-right traditional parties. Far-right parties have been given a symbolic uplift. The center-right believes in an innocent way political predators can be tamed and made edible for the European public morale, the more they share the same rhetoric on immigration and EU future. Whereas the far-right enjoys the inclusion and access to executive power. If limits between conservative and extreme right become so blurred and fluid, why would not provide figures the example of the missing link, therefore? Mr. Bannon sees that as the rationale of his endeavors. Why would a commentator like myself have the feeling that 2024 would mark the success of an unstoppable march, an unaufhaltsamer March towards complete electoral victory? On one hand, because mainstream traditional parties are likely to give way to such things to happen. They beat into retreat, shying away from confrontation and strike a compromise, or what they believe a compromise could be, and ask for political support or cooperation in sharing power. Second, let us have a look into what recent polls say. Populist parties, including far-right parties, have more than tripled their support in Europe in the last 2 decades. The leaders are in the governments of 11 countries Europe-wide, and those governments seem solid and constantly backed up by national electorates. It has been a case of steady growth. Some 2 decades ago, they were but a marginal presence, accounting for just 7% of votes across the continent. Back in 1998, only 2 European countries, and certainly not the largest, that is Slovakia and Switzerland, had populists in government, with barely no attachment to the far right, at least in public. Nowadays, and most recent national elections had it proven, 1 in 4 votes cast was for a populist far-right party. In other words, the number of Europeans ruled by a government with at least one quote-unquote populist in cabinet has increased from 12.5 million to 170 million. Maybe this is why the Alternative für Deutschland holds now positions in every German Landestag and has more than 90 seats in the Bundestag. Maybe this is why the Italian Lega Nord and the anti-establishment tax and spend Cinque Stelle, you remember who built Cinque Stelle, it was an actor, won nearly 50% of the popular vote. Silvio Berlusconi and his 4-time electoral victory shines nowadays as forlorn golden times. In the Netherlands, if needed to add, it is Geert Wilders' Freedom Party, and all these parties are about freedom, as you can see from the title, who raised to becoming the 2nd largest parliamentary force. Even the extreme left-wing parties are moving on, although less successful than their far-right counterparts. Podemos in Spain looks vital, and so does La France Insoumise of Jean-Luc Mélenchon. The tide started to turn in early 2000s, when the Netherlands establishment was rocked by the rapid rise of Pim Fortuyn, quickly followed by Jean-Marie Le Pen's presence in the 2002 presidential run-off vote. This is why history sometimes explains things of today. 3 years later, referenda in France and the Netherlands rejected the drafted EU constitution. That was the beginning. Since then, anti-establishment populism gradually turned towards the political extreme, has snowballed, embracing the arguments offered by the 2008 financial crash and the recent refugee crisis. The Greek Syriza successively took 27% and then 36% of the national votes. UKIP spurred Britain into the Brexit, and Marine Le Pen in France won 33% in the last presidential run-off vote. When seeing the process from afar, it looks like the world itself is rafting towards the same situation. Populists playing the liberal and anti-establishment key have been elected to executive offices in India, Brazil, Mexico, the Philippines, and so on. Would the liberal conservative EPP survive a presumptive defeat in the forthcoming European elections is the question I address. There'll be no defeat, since the EPP experiences now small rises in polls after months of losses. Small indeed, but enough today to keep the EPP afloat. It is likely the group will numerically hold the largest number of seats and consequently win the competition in the eyes of the voters. But MPs will come from home, or most of them from their homes, with an obligation to smooth links with the far-right representatives. The more they would parade under the same national colors. This is the trick. There will be an EPP that would not respect its name and contents. As for the SNDs, they would account for the local losses and swallow defeat, which is an unfolding process in their case and not a sudden surprise, since declining has been their magic definition everywhere in Europe in the past years. Some social democratic parties have embraced a far-right agenda only for populistic reasons. And that was the case of Romania's Social Democratic Party shaking hands with the Coalition for Family group in restrictively defining the meaning of family in the Constitution as a two-gender union. I must pause here just for a couple of moments and tell you more about this. This is a case of political pathology. Back in 2015, fringe extreme right groups in Romania who have not been coalesced into a party, because Romania has basically no extreme right party, it has only extreme right nostalgies from the interwar period, started amassing signatures on lists just under the question whether marriage should be defined as a two-gender union and thus have this definition enclosed in the constitutional text, which sounds appealing. The Constitution, the fundamental text, is not about marriage. It's about the definition of state, it's about the definition of institution, it's about the social contract between the state and the power of the state and the citizens, about the obligations of the citizens, about the rights, and so on and so forth, about how the state should be organized and function. There were, by the end of last year, that was November 2018, and we will come back to this question, to this issue later on, 3.3 million signatures have been gathered on this list, apparently supporting the positive answer of bringing a definition of marriage, a restrictive definition of marriage, into the constitutional text. Notwithstanding that the Romanian Civil Code do have a definition of the marriage as a two-gender union. The bullet whizzed past our ears. And that was a very interesting plot. Who conspired in this plot? Apart from far-right groups that succeeded to find a common fluid and discuss between themselves how to build this referendum up, there was a combination of external factors as well. There'd be no surprise that the Romanian Orthodox Church later on started backing this referendum. There would be no surprise that the Roman Catholic Church in Romania backed this referendum, and all Protestant denominations. But the most active religious denominations in the beginning were the neo-Protestant groups. Why? Because they got a theme coming from across the ocean, from extreme right, very religious, extremely conservative American groups. And they met with a very subtle Russian intention to keep this referendum afloat through the means of connections between the conservative sides of the Orthodox Church in Romania and the Moscow Patriarchate, which is basically Putin. What would have been the second... Okay, the referendum didn't work. What would have been the second stage if the answer would have been positive? Bring another referendum up with a question about abortion. Should be abortion banned, or should be abortion accepted as a legal norm in Romania? Now, that would have split the society along very deep cracks that come back from the late 1980s history of communist Romania, when abortion was banned by Ceausescu, with a clear mindset that while banning abortion, the demographic situation of the country will improve. God, no. It cannot improve this way. But this is what the mechanical thinking of the communist leaders at the time imagined to be. In the end, that would have meant, if a second referendum of this kind would have come forth, it would have meant that Romania and most Orthodox countries afterwards would have become not just very conservative, but extremely religious in the sense of bringing the church, not just the exercise of belief, into the executive components of the state, thus changing the very inner nature of the state itself. And now I come back. And the Social Democrats in Romania supported it, which is quite unclear. But Social Democrats, they should fight for equality, not for division. And a very conservative answer to the definition, to the question addressing the definition of the family, would have not been in the ideological turf of the Social Democrats. It should have looked upon somewhere in, maybe in the conservative realm of the center-right and right parties in Romania. No. The Social Democrats, the National Liberals, the most two important parties in Romania, jumped over this chance, hoping that votes for the referendum would then turn into votes for their own political necessity, which is a false assessment. The room for Social Democrats left has been taken by the populist voices, mostly from the far right. Some say the rising popularity of the Spanish socialists could save face. I doubt it is realistic. Now tell me please, what has the Labour been throughout the Brexit in UK? And what did it do to somehow stall it? The Labours were never into the debate. They were just voices, individual voices, and the fringe extreme left leader, Corbyn, which was not even decided whether to support or to reject the Brexit in the beginning. He was a sort of a Farage on the left side of the political spectrum, which was absolutely paradoxical. The German SPD suffers of chronic headaches, whereas the French and the Italian socialist parties contemplate their glorious past only. The present is too harsh for them, and populism is in the order of the day. All happened and happens under our very eyes, slowly but stealthily and steadily. Just the other day, Ralf Schurer's book came under my eyes. You might know about this professor. And the title is absolutely bloody. Lasst uns, I will not translate it because it's easy to understand. Lasst uns Populisten sein. 10 Thesen für eine neue Streitkultur. This is a very popular book now, today. And if you go into a bookshop in Berlin, you'll find it. It's been sold out, although it costs something like 35 euros, which is quite a lot. And some sentences of him. And you will recognize the pun, because it's an intentional pun onto the words of Karl Marx' manifesto, Communist Manifesto, back in 1848. Ein Gespenst geht in Europa. Das Gespenst des Populismus. Yeah? In the words of Karl Marx, ein Gespenst geht in Europa, das Gespenst des Kommunismus. Alle Mächte des alten Europa haben sich zu einer heiligen Hetzjagd gegen dies Gespenst verbündet. Der Populismus wird bereits von allen europäischen Mächten als Macht anerkannt. So populism would then in the end be recognized, acknowledged as not just powerful, but a power in itself throughout Europe. The populist discourse is designed to create a diffuse but overwhelming fear about the future of Europe, as it is fed by feelings of uncertainty generated by the 2015s and later waves of extra-European migration. This sentiment, the Union is not safe or well guarded, has been then greatly amplified by terrorist attacks in major cities, which, although not always directly connected with the behavior of the newcomers, brought onto them the scapegoat anathema, thus playing onto the black and white rhetoric of the populists. They deftly seized the opportunity and came forth with powerful images and symbols alluding to the necessity of defending the continent. Die Festung Europa. They have found enough sensitive ears among Europeans to dream now of political victory either this year or later. And this is where I finger point at the institution that ought to do the utmost to prevent, through properly using its vast capacities of disseminating knowledge and social and moral values, fear from spreading into various strata of our societies and make populists popular and extreme, anti-liberal, Eurosceptic ideologies and parties interesting and attractive. And which is this institution? It is the nation-state. Is the nation-state institutional paradigm the ultimate form of communitary, political and social organization? That was the question my friend István provoked me with, while asking me to deliver an answer to it, no matter how crude or amateurish could it be. The question is not by far simply rhetoric. And there is a large academic community whose members are either preaching for the definitive existence of the nation-state or betting on the time of its pompous exodus. It is somehow odd such questions haunt us after the centennial commemoration of the collapse of the three European empires and the anniversary of the coming of age of the national state throughout the continent. The truth is that nation-states failed to educate their citizens in the spirit of preventing the European Union to question its own existence. The more younger generations, less sensitive to the narrative of European values, from basic human rights to the right to live in peace, are prone to take its liberties for granted and forget what is the very meaning of the European Union exists for. There's been word yesterday evening about losing the memory of war. Yes, but the European Union is not living on its own memory only. It's about transforming it into a generational legacy so that everybody would know that it is the largest peace project ever built on the continent. And it will endure if generations after generations would understand that this is the bid for them to raise their children in peace. That's as simple as that. Prosperity comes next. Peace comes first. A large number of Eurosceptics and followers of populist leaders, or members of fringe parties, are only about to enter the age of maturity. The pervasive and persuasive power of social media, among other factors, has won the war with the state-run educational systems and casted rationality out of the polity. In clear terms, proper education would have been the antidote to populism, whatever form would have taken, from Brexit to xenophobia. And it is, what I say, it's more about slow demise. It's not about the disparition of the nation-state, however weakened it is today. It is about the state gradually and almost inconspicuously losing one of its reasons of existence and a pillar of its contract with the citizens as such. In a comment published by The Guardian just the other day, a very good friend of ours, Ivan Krastev, argued that no matter the noise populists of all colors create in public, they cannot provide answers to quick solutions to the huge intra-European, that is east to west, working force migration, which is in numbers far more important than whatever flow of migrants coming from Turkey or Syria or from God knows what other Asian countries would mean in figures. And this intra-European migration took incredible proportions in the past decade. And he's right, Ivan Krastev, in exposing this paradox. The majority of Eastern European citizens seeking to relocate themselves in the West comes from member states who had been run by electorally successful populist governments for years. Why, if populists would try to build the heaven on earth? Why would they just try to lose their connection with their original countries and leave them for good and resettle in the western side of the continent? Then this is a question the populist rhetorics cannot answer. They don't have an answer to do it. And this is why Mr. Bannon has found a fertile ground to toil. He senses coordination is mandatory as an ingredient of complete success. He may take upon himself the responsibility of working it out, himself and other important leaders. And it seems as full political harvest is ahead in 2024. And I would say, in poetic terms, it's a harvest from hell. Quote, "There are bad times just around the corner. There are dark clouds traveling through the sky and no good winning. About the silver lining, for we know from experience they won't roll by." This is what Noel Coward wrote once. This is basically the situation. I've also prepared, this is the end of the written narrative, but I prepared for you some slides. A couple of minutes, yes, I'll be like thunder from the sky.
Very fast.
Very fast, just to show you the dimensions of what migration is about. How can we use this? Because I don't know. This is the situation between 2004 and 2013. We're not accustomed to see all these figures because the demographical situation in Eastern Europe is by far tragic. The biggest reductions in population were recorded in Germany and Romania. And Romania, among other EU countries, has the lowest birth rate. And this is against this background that migration between East and West happens. I'll just skip the fact that Romania is with the scores between other countries with the lowest life expectancies at birth. It is the last census in Romania back in 2011. That was in red, the usual resident population. And compared with the previous census in 2002, the population decreased with almost 1.6 million people. But most of them, this decrease is mostly due to the external migration. As you can see, what's been left behind is a thick population of older people and a smaller part of very young future citizens, that is children. What's been left behind is mostly with low educational level. In 2015, the red mark paragraph, immigrants from the EU member state, from within the total number of immigrants, highest in Romania, 87% of all immigrants in the EU, and then it's Lithuania, and then it's Hungary, which enjoys a smaller size in general population, Croatia, Latvia, Estonia, and Portugal. This is what means intra-EU Romanian migration. It's a huge interest for countries which are culturally alike, that is Italy and Spain, and then it's UK, Germany, France, Austria, and Scandinavia somewhere. Almost 2.35 million Romanians live and work in the EU. And that is against what's been left back home, which is something like 80 million people. That figure, 2.35 million, is the official figure. There is an unofficial estimate, which raises to 3.2 million the number of Romanian citizens working abroad. And most of them are prone to resettle in the countries of new residence. By age group, you can see again in red over there, it's a huge amount of people belonging to the stratum of young, active populations. That is, by depleting Romania of its own working force. This is just an example of what would happen with the doctors, with the physicians. In France, Romanian immigration in France. You can see how steeply went this process, mostly in the last years of 2000. But it's not the problem of Romania only. It's the problem in general, a problem addressing Central Europe and Eastern Europe. And you can see which are the reasons why some of those people left, and against this, what are the consequences of them leaving their countries of birth. And one of them is that the GDP suffers in all these sending countries, starting with Poland, Hungary, some Adriatic countries, members of the European Union, like Slovenia and Croatia, and Romania, Bulgaria, the Baltic countries too. And this is what happens with the migration in general. And it addresses the whole of Central and Eastern Europe, from 1990 to 2012. And this is the last aggregated figure I have, and it's been public. So I'll stop here. There'll be so many other things to be said, but I'd better not bring everybody to the...
Thank you, Mihai. Just we are running out of time, but thank you for this fantastic presentation. Maybe we have some very little time just for one question. I'm sorry, but we have to go on to the next. Why I enjoyed your presentation a lot, but my question is whether is it not too pessimistic? Certainly it might be a wishful thinking what I'm asking. You are a historian and you might talk about something like what we call the zeitgeist. And just to raise some counter-arguments, you also mentioned this Romanian referendum, which was finally not approved by the population. And there might be a lot of counter-arguments whether there are some pro-European movements, especially in Britain, for example, maybe too late, but all over in Europe, people who are fighting back against populism. Don't you think that there is still some hope in the future? As you mentioned, in 2024, it might be the end of the European Union as we know it, but maybe on the other hand, there will be a backlash from pro-European forces, and we might be more optimistic. Please try to be short, we are running out of time, but I think it might be somehow clarified. Why are you so pessimistic?
Well, you provoked me.
Yeah.
I'll come back to my slides. Have this. Thank you, Razvan. Well, the truth is that Eastern Europe looks different. It's something else. And it gives me a different approach onto what I could consider as pro-European, Euro-optimistic votes in 2024. Because we tend to forget that there is a huge crack, which is not the Hamptonian border, between the eastern part of the continent, that is Central and Eastern Europe, and the rest of the continent. No matter whether we're talking about majority Orthodox countries, or countries which are between the Catholic realm and the Protestant realm of Europe. This is the religious landscape in Central and Eastern Europe. You can see the Orthodox majority, the Catholic majority, and where religiously the society is mixed. That's very interesting. The belief in God is more widespread in Central and Eastern Europe. It's not the belief in what the European Union could provide to the citizens. It's people turning more and more onto a flair of imagining that their lives can be better organized in a different cultural environment. And there will not be, from this point of view, I will not keep them as Eurosceptic, but Euro-indifferent, which is even worse than Eurosceptic, because usually extreme negative tendencies would get an antidote into extreme positive tendencies. But when indifference is set in, then there is no medicine to combat it. This is in attending the church. So people would go, would vote for, or would consider themselves interested in religion, or would base their lives on an abstract love for God, may it be the Orthodox God or whatever other else, but in the end they will not go to the church. It's not about institutions, it's about what could save them apart from institutional solutions. And this is where Eastern Europe is different from Western Europe. Let me just go to the other. Fewer people in Western European countries see religion as a key component of national identity. What you can see here on the top, you can see that the most important key component of their community identity, may it be national or social structure alike, is religion itself. Whereas the churches would not discuss about the European Union. Nor the Orthodox churches, nor the Roman Catholic churches, nor the Protestant churches. The European Union is not a part of their public discourse. It's about morale, it's about everything else. It's not about the benefits of living together in the European Union, which is seen as a layman project that has not been ever backed by a sort of transcendent morality. About accepting Muslims, where is the largest drive against accepting the difference, again, in Central and Eastern Europe. You can see here at the bottom of this chart. Jews and Muslims is the same thing. Top of the chart, the lowest levels of acceptance. And we tend to say, okay, it's a xenophobic society. No, it's a society that bases its own system of values on something else that is not what the European Union is about. And that's where the nation state fails in its educational activities. And I'll just stop here.